Sometimes the most horrifying stories don't begin with a scream, they begin with silence. A fragile, beautiful silence that belongs to someone who never got the chance to speak for herself. Christina Ann Pangalangan was born on March 28, 2006 in South Carolina, the youngest in a family that, on the outside, looked like any other. But from the very beginning, Christina's life was different. At birth, she was diagnosed with cerebral palsy, a neurological disorder that made everyday movements a challenge. Later, she'd be diagnosed with epilepsy and scoliosis, making her even more dependent on others for the most basic of needs. She couldn't walk. She couldn't speak. She relied on a wheelchair, on medication, on care. She was vulnerable, but never invisible. Because what Christina lacked in physical ability, she made up for in spirit. To those who truly knew her, she was more than her diagnosis. She was full of warmth. She loved cartoons with a passion, especially Dora the Explorer and SpongeBob SquarePants. She could watch them for hours, smiling to herself, lost in their worlds. She loved swimming, the feeling of water against her skin, and she was known to be adorably stubborn, particularly around her sisters. Ashley and Elizabeth, both adults by the time this story unfolded. Christina had her ways, and when she wanted something, she made it known in her own unique language of emotion, expression, and energy. She wasn't just someone with special needs. She was someone special, period. But what happens when a child so defenseless, so full of innocence is placed in the hands of people who are supposed to love and protect her, and instead, she disappears? This is not just a tragedy, it's a betrayal. On True Crimes by Dominic, we bring you the case of Christina Pangalangan, a story that will break your heart, shake your faith in humanity, and leave you questioning how something like this could happen in plain sight. A story where the people closest to Christina, the ones entrusted with her care, may have been the ones to let her down in the most horrifying way. Because in this case, silence wasn't just a part of who Christina was. It became the weapon used against her. Before we go deeper into this chilling mystery, take a moment to like this video, subscribe, and tap the notification bell. We uncover true crime stories like this every week on True Crimes by Dominic, giving voice to victims who were never allowed to speak for themselves. And as you watch, ask yourself, do you think vulnerability makes someone more loved or more targeted? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Your voice might just be the one that pushes this case back into the light. Because Christina deserves to be remembered. Not as a tragedy, but as a person. Let's begin. There's a certain kind of light that shines from a child like Christina, the kind that makes people stop and smile without even realizing it. And for those who met her, even briefly, that light was unforgettable. At Colleton County Middle School, Christina wasn't just a student. She was part of the heart of the classroom. Despite the challenges of her condition, she loved being surrounded by her classmates. Their laughter, their chatter, the way they included her, all of it made her come alive. She craved connection, not pity. Attention, not isolation. She didn't need words to express herself. Her face said everything. Whether she was happy, frustrated, tired, or excited, Christina's emotions were always written clearly across her face. Her joy was contagious, her spirit magnetic. For those moments in that classroom, she wasn't the girl in the wheelchair, she was just Christina, a part of something, and that meant the world to her. But behind the scenes, not everything was as bright. Her mother, Rita Pangalangan, worked at the very same school, a teacher with over 25 years in the education system, respected and well-known. In fact, just a few years earlier, she'd been honored as Teacher of the Year. On the surface, she seemed like the kind of mother any child would be lucky to have, dedicated, experienced, and deeply embedded in both the school and the local disability advocacy community. But in 2016, cracks began to show. That year, the South Carolina Department of Social Services filed its first complaint against Rita. According to the report, Rita had allegedly failed to provide adequate care and medical attention for Christina. It raised red flags about how her basic needs were being met or not met behind closed doors. At first, it may have seemed like an isolated concern, a misunderstanding, but it wasn't. The complaints didn't stop. They kept coming. one after another. By 2018, Rita had entered a relationship with Larry Eugene King Jr., a man from Walterboro. Their relationship grew, but Christina, still entirely dependent on Rita, remained under her care. Then came 2019, and with it a report that would haunt those who heard it. That year, Rita brought Christina to school in a state no child should ever be in: burns, all over her face, neck, and chest. Not just red marks, not just scalding. Open wounds described as having an odor, likely due to infection. There were no bandages, no ointment, no effort to protect her injuries. She had been sent to school like that. Staff were horrified. Immediately, the Colleton County School District contacted DSS. When Rita was questioned, her explanation was simple. Christina had spilled hot water on herself while sleeping, but that only raised more questions. What kind of accident like that happens at night and leaves a child completely untreated by morning? DSS asked Rita to get her daughter immediate medical attention, but when Christina returned to school the very next day, she still had the same burns, still uncovered, still untreated. There were no medical records, no hospital visit, no evidence that any help had been sought. Yet, she remained in Rita's custody. The schools sounded the alarm again and again, but their concerns seemed to vanish into thin air. DSS didn't follow up. No one showed up. No one intervened. No one came. Meanwhile, Rita, rather than showing concern for her daughter's pain, grew more defensive. According to reports, she told social workers she was sick of the school's constant interference. She felt targeted, harassed, and eventually, she threatened to pull Christina out of school entirely just to stop the reports. Let that sink in. Rather than confront the care issues head-on, she considered isolating Christina, removing the one place where people actually noticed her, where people cared enough to speak up. And then, there's what the people around Rita began to notice. One of them was a former roommate, someone who had, on many occasions, been asked to help care for Christina, often without warning. Sometimes Rita would leave for hours with barely a heads up, expecting her to step in. The roommate recalled one moment she would never forget. One day when she pushed back and said she couldn't help, she had work. Rita reportedly told her to just leave Christina in the car with the windows cracked. "I do it all the time," Rita said. But this wasn't just a quick grocery store run. This was a nonverbal child with multiple disabilities, trapped in a car, left to wait, alone. That moment, it chilled her. It stayed with her. Not just because of what was said, but because of how casually it was said. As if Christina wasn't a human being, just an inconvenience. The signs were there. People noticed. People tried to help. But every time someone raised their voice, every time someone said, "Something isn't right," the system fell silent. The response was nothing. And that silence would soon prove deadly. The courtroom was heavy. You could feel the tension in the air, not just from the gravity of the charges, but from the years of pain, grief, and fractured memories now laid bare for all to see. The jury had been sent to deliberate. They were gone just over 2 hours. But even in that short window, they came back with questions, not about whether the defendants were guilty or not, but about how to interpret the charges themselves. They wanted clarification on the language of the law, on the weight of each word tied to that little girl's death. Meanwhile, inside the courtroom, the emotions were unbearable. One of Christina's older sisters, Elizabeth, was called to testify. Her voice cracked almost immediately. Through tears, she did what no child should ever have to do: plead for the world to understand her mother. "My mom, she loved Christina so much," Elizabeth said. "She was a good mom. God made her Christina's mother because he knew she was strong enough to handle it." Her words hung in the air, not as a denial of what had happened, but as a desperate attempt to separate the woman she remembered from the woman accused. She spoke of Rita's years as a single parent, the countless hours spent working multiple jobs just to keep her household afloat. When insurance denied Christina a basic walker, calling it a luxury, not a necessity, it was Rita who stepped up. She cleaned houses, she tutored kids, she made sacrifices. All of it, Elizabeth said, was for Christina. And yet, for all that effort, for all the ways Rita had once shown love and care, It wasn't enough to explain away what happened on that brutal August afternoon. Just a few feet away, Rita sat quietly at the defense table, holding a tissue to her mouth. Her shoulders trembled. She cried silently, barely moving, as her daughter spoke. Her expression didn't change much, but her eyes never left the floor. Love doesn't always protect, and in this case, if love was present, it wasn't enough. Because Christina, a 13-year-old girl with no voice, no mobility, and no way to fight for herself, had been left to die in the back seat of a sweltering car while her mother and her boyfriend binged on meth just feet away. No amount of tears could undo that. At trial, the defense clung to their strategy that it had been a mistake, a terrible, horrible accident, that nobody meant for Christina to die, that drugs clouded their judgment, that it wasn't malicious, just reckless. But the prosecution saw it differently. They saw a child already failed by the system, a child who had cried out in silence long before she ever got into that car. And they saw two adults who had chosen meth over responsibility, who had walked past that car over and over again, who didn't knock out the window, who didn't act in time. They saw a death that was preventable, and they asked the jury to see it the same way. The trial would come to an end. The verdict would soon follow. But no matter the outcome, there is no victory here, because Christina is still gone. And what we're left with isn't just a case about negligence. It's a story about silence, about how the cracks in a system can swallow a child whole, about how love alone doesn't always save, not without action, not without accountability. There's a haunting line in child protection law. When we fail to intervene, we fail the child. In Christina's case, the failures were stacked one on top of the other until the weight of it all crushed the very life it was supposed to protect. September 2023. A courtroom sits heavy with silence. Not the kind of silence you get from boredom. This was the suffocating quiet of anticipation, of truth on the verge of being spoken. At the front stood solicitor Celeste Stone, and she wasn't just delivering closing arguments, she was walking the jury through a timeline of failure. She traced every movement, every moment, every missed opportunity to save a child who couldn't save herself. She pointed out the hours that passed while Christina Pangalangan, nonverbal, disabled, and entirely defenseless, was left in a hot car, alone, her life draining away while those responsible pretended not to notice. Stone didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. Her words were scalpel sharp. She asked the jury to remember, not to imagine, but to remember. To picture the crime scene footage, the burns, the body. To recall the haunting image of a child left strapped in place, unable to cry for help, suffering for 5 unthinkable hours. Then she pivoted from memory to the law. Malice, she explained, doesn't always wear a mask of rage. It doesn't always come screaming, fists raised. Sometimes it looks like nothing. Sometimes malice is indifference. The look in someone's eyes when they see suffering and do nothing. That, Stone argued, was what defined this case. She laid it out. Christina was entirely dependent. She couldn't speak, couldn't move, couldn't escape. Every basic need in her life had to be provided by someone else, and yet, in her final hours, no one came for her. No one opened that door. No one checked. That, Stone said, is disregard for human life. And then she used a word that pierced the silence. Torture. She didn't flinch. She let it sit. And then she said to the jury, "But in this courtroom today, I'm asking you to call it what it truly is, murder." The defense, however, had a different angle. Larry King's attorney, Gil Gatt, told the jury that Larry had no legal obligation to care for Christina. He wasn't her father. He wasn't her guardian. Gatt claimed the car had been left running, and this was all just a terrible, unforeseen accident. A tragedy, yes, but not a crime. Then came Rita's final defense. Her attorney, Dane Phillips, made one last desperate attempt to shift the jury's gaze. He called Rita forward. She stood just feet away from the jurors, trembling, her shoulders shaking with sobs. Her face was red, soaked in tears. The image was carefully staged human, broken, maternal. This, Phillips told them, voice low, is this woman's life, her freedom. And I'm not saying she did everything right. God knows she didn't. But out there, he gestured beyond the courtroom. You can be angry at Rita. In here, you must follow the law. She returned to her seat, quietly weeping into her hands. But the jury? They had heard enough. After just 2 hours of deliberation, they returned with a verdict. We, the jury, in the matter of the murder of Christina and Pangalangan, find the defendant guilty. On the charge of inflicting great bodily injury to a child, guilty. On the charge of criminal conspiracy, not guilty. Both Rita Pangalangan and Larry Eugene King Jr. were convicted. Rita was sentenced to 37 years. Larry received 32. Both were handed additional 20-year concurrent sentences related to child abuse. The system had finally responded, but justice came too late. In October 2024, a civil settlement was finalized, a quiet financial end to a case that never should have reached this point. The total amount awarded, $314,055.82. Of that, $195,000 came from the South Carolina Department of Social Services, the very agency that had been warned repeatedly and did nothing. The lawsuit alleged that DSS violated its own mandates, designed to protect vulnerable children from abuse and neglect. Christina's burns, her untreated injuries, the school's multiple reports, all ignored. The rest of the settlement was tied to Christina's wrongful death estate, a formal acknowledgement written in legal ink that a life had been taken and no one stopped it. Christina's funeral was held on August 14, 2019. A quiet service at Faith Church, just days before she was supposed to begin 8th grade. Her obituary was simple, heartbreakingly so. She was remembered as a loving, joyful soul. And maybe that's the most devastating part. She never got to tell her own story. Christina never spoke a word, but in death she forced the world to listen. Her case didn't end with a gavel. It didn't stop at sentencing or settlements. Instead, it exposed a dangerous gap in South Carolina law, a legal blind spot that made prosecuting child deaths harder depending on age. Under existing state law at the time, the charge of homicide by child abuse could only be applied if the victim was under 11 years old. Christina was 13. That meant prosecutors couldn't charge based on recklessness alone. They had to prove intent. In this case, they could. But Solicitor Stone warned, not every case would be so clear. Not every child would get justice. And so Christina's case became a call for change. Her story inspired a proposed bill that would raise the age threshold for child abuse homicide charges from 11 to 18, closing the loophole that let children like her fall through. Christina's life was short. Her world was full of hardship. But in death, she ignited something rare: legal reform, driven not by outrage alone, but by a collective moral reckoning. Today, that bill still carries her shadow. Her name, her pain, and her silence echo through every courtroom it enters. Christina loved cartoons. She loved to be seen. She needed care, and she needed protection. She was failed, over and over, until it was too late. But now, the law may grow where she couldn't. And maybe, just maybe, her voice, though never spoken, will go on to save the lives of children whose stories are still being written. Sometimes justice comes too late, and sometimes it arrives just in time to remind us of how many chances we had to stop the bleeding before it ever began. Christina in Pangalangan never spoke a word yet. Her silence has echoed louder than most screams. She was born into a world where she needed others to fight for her, and far too often they didn't. The people who were supposed to protect her, her mother, her caretaker, the system failed again and again, until all that remained was the aftermath of neglect, dressed in silence, and a child gone too soon. But Christina's story didn't end at the grave. It didn't end in the courtroom. It became something more. It became a mirror, one that forces us to look at how easily the most vulnerable among us can be overlooked, how red flags are ignored, how systems fall silent when a child cannot scream for help. And maybe the most haunting part is this: what if the law hadn't caught up? What if there hadn't been a camera? A prosecutor with vision? A jury that listened? Would Christina have just become another quiet statistic, forgotten, buried, invisible? Her case is a reminder that laws are written by people but changed by pain. And sometimes it takes a tragedy to force that change. Her name now stands behind a proposed law meant to protect other children, to ensure that no other child like Christina is ever left to die between the cracks of technicality. So here's the question I want to leave you with. How many other Christinas are out there unseen, unheard, unprotected, waiting for someone to finally care enough to act? Let's talk about it in the comments. Your voice might reach someone who needs to hear it. And if this story moved you, share it. Don't let Christina's story disappear into the noise. Let it ring out. Let it be a warning, a call to action, a legacy. Because when we tell these stories loudly and widely, we do more than remember, we prevent. You're part of this. You're not just watching, you're helping. You're becoming a witness, a retell. And here at True Crimes by Dominic, we don't turn away. If you haven't already, make sure to subscribe and turn on the notification bell. We uncover true stories like this every week, stories that deserve to be heard. And if you found meaning in Christina's case, take a second to like this video, share it, and drop a comment. Someone out there may see it, and it might just open their eyes before it's too late. Until next time, stay aware, stay human, and never forget the names that were nearly silenced. This is True Crimes by Dominic.